Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riding from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer, and with me is my good friend, once again, Deb Romero, certified Alexander technique instructor. And today's topic is about the head neck balance specifically, which is a big deal in your work, Deb, as
Mm-hmm.
kind of a primary basis of the Alexander technique.
Mm-hmm.
And as we talk about horse postures, I sort of wanted to really dive deep into this because for horses, the head neck balance is really the final piece of the puzzle. But when we're trying to put horses in frames, that's where we
Mm.
start. And we start
Mm.
by manipulating the head neck balance
Right.
rather than freeing the head neck balance.
So could we also say, because I'm wondering if the word balance makes people think it's a place? Because we've talked about this in other podcasts about it's like a relationship, it's constantly moving. It's not, oh, if I get right here, that's good. And I think that's that frame you're talking about. It's
That's
like
what I would call a frame.
a
Like,
static a
I
static
think,
place, and it's not a place, it's a relationship to whatever's going on in the body at that time.
and that to me describes balance.
Okay,
So
good.
I think
Good,
you
good, good.
use the term all the time, are my joints open and available?
Constantly saying
And
that to myself.
I use the term, am I balancing? Because when I think of balance, it now is kind of intuitive to me to automatically go into three dimensions and to think
Mhm.
in terms of balance as sort of a moving orb.
Oh,
And
I like that.
when you say, are my joints open and available? That to me is just a pseudonym for balance.
Okay,
I go,
good.
so I'm glad we got on the same page. And I know we're
Yeah.
on the same page because we end up doing this thing all the
What is
time.
this
You guys,
thing?
we do not plan. If you're looking at the video and not the
Yeah,
audio, we end up like matching our color
it's
shirts
blue day.
in
We're
today's Blue Day.
what the heck?
I know, and we
No,
never plan this, but we,
I think we're just very interconnected in thought.
yes.
So
Because I
anyway.
literally like grab a shirt out of my closet and go, okay, this will work. And you very often show up in the same color or something
I
complementary.
know. Yep.
So, and that's where I think it's good to play with words and to really look at when we use words,
Mhm.
because words are just symbols of what we're trying to communicate as an experience,
Right.
right? And
And
so
words are a big thing in the Alexander community because you can change a whole body just by using a language.
different, the same is true in the horse world.
Yeah. You
Like what
just
makes me crazy is that we haven't changed our language to
mhm.
help people ride better or to help horses move better. Like one
Good
of the
point.
words that to me is glaringly absent from the horse world is the word stability. And when we
Mhm.
even saying the word stability, I have to say stability like you're getting your sea legs. The joints are open and available. We're balancing constantly and rebalancing our alignment to gravity or our horse's
Right.
alignment to gravity while there's all these forces of motion going on. And so,
And that's really important. I think I mentioned it long ago is sometimes as humans and we think of balance, we think it's a place. It's a static stillness, but it's not. To create that stillness, there has to be inner movement, very subtle changes. Like you said, your sea legs or a surfer, or, they're not standing still
yeah, because
in
even
that
if we
sense.
are on static ground, even if we're not riding, I go, the truth of our physical reality is that if we're walking on cement versus grass versus deep sand versus hard sand versus loose dirt or
Hmm.
hard packed dirt, that ground force reaction is affecting
Hmm.
how we're adjusting our coordination during motion. So stability, and even the earth is spinning and the ground we're walking on is
I
changing,
know.
or the texture of the chair we're sitting in is different, or our shoes are different, you know?
Right.
It's like all of those factors take away any illusion of staticness or stillness.
Hmm.
So to me, balance is achieving the same coordination by constantly, minutely adapting.
Right.
And that's what you call open and available.
Okay.
I think. Am I,
Sounds good. That sounds good to me. Yeah. Because people are always thinking it's a place, that there's right or wrong, and none of that. That creates the stiffness, is when we start thinking that balance is a static, locking, tensing thing to get to find it, like rain contact. I mean, that's a whole another podcast on it itself. But
but
that is,
that's directly related to,
yeah,
especially our horse's head neck balance,
yeah,
right? Or our head neck balance is going to determine how we use our arms, how we use our hands, our fingers in order
good
to have a
point.
rein contact.
Hmm.
And that's why I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a closer look at specifically the head neck balance, because it really is like when human hands meet reins and bits and horse's head and
Mm.
neck, that's probably the toughest relationship between a horse and rider.
Completely agree. And it's because of there's a lot of things going on in the human. Our startle reflex, for one, is
Or
to
the
pull back and
horses.
tense as a human
Yes.
if we're not balanced on in our head, neck, back, and pelvis. So here we are on this moving animal. If we don't have that coordination of our own head, neck, back, and pelvis, we're gonna startle and lock our hand and grip with our hands.
Yeah. And when I started writing the workbooks on the from basic handling to balancing a horse under saddle, when I went to the dictionary to look up balance, to go, okay, like what's my starting point? How is it defined? It literally said sort of the act of not falling over. And I go, ooh,
I like
there's
that.
there's so much more to that though, because what you're
Uh-huh.
describing is, even if we're not falling off, if we're going into our instinctual physical reaction
Mm.
of sort of the fetal position or pulling our hands towards us, we're going to have a boatload of problems with our horse, even if we're not falling off. So I go there, I
Hmm.
have to think of balance in layers. And I go, by the time we're good enough to not fall off our horse, that's only the very beginning.
Hmm.
It's like the most basic beginning part of riding. There's so much more to it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so talk a little bit about the human head neck balance, how that works in Alexander technique, because it's
Well,
still a work in progress for
oh
me.
yeah,
And
constant.
I think way back, I somewhere on my YouTube channel, I have I think it's under the playlist Horse Geeks Lessons, where you did a lesson for me that we recorded.
Oh wow.
Because I think when I first started doing Zoom, like back in 2020, every time I
That's
would
right.
look at
We
myself,
did one. I
I was
remember.
like,
That's
why do
right.
I have this head tilt? Like, what's going on with this? I didn't
What's
realize I was tilting my head all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like in what I really like in your workbooks is that you say, use a mirror, use video, take pictures, because we
We're
don't
not aware.
we're not aware. Our subconscious thinks everything's fine and in control and hunky dory. And then when we see a video or a picture, it's like, oh, wow,
I
that's not
had
what I
no
thought.
idea.
I
I
had no
didn't think I
idea I
looked
was
like that
doing
at
that.
all.
And then you think of it as all, being the stimulus of even when you're riding, if somebody says, pick up a trot at A, that's a whole stimulus within itself of, oh my gosh, I've got to do something right there. So
Mm,
being aware that that stimulus could cause tension. And
yes.
yeah. So anyway, yeah, the head neck relationship, the easiest way to explain it um, is like you said, is just asking the question to someone, and there's no right or wrong answer, is do you know where your head meets your neck? And most people point to like C3, C4. And
Under
when
the
you get
jaw.
under the jaw, yeah, and when you
Hmm.
give them the information, well, actually, it's behind your nose and in between your ears. That's your yes joint. And all you have to do is change that language, and it gives a person a completely new perspective
Yes,
of
it
movement.
changes
It
it
just changes
because
everything.
we don't often think of our skull balancing on the bones of the cervical spine or all the way down to the sacrum and
Mhm.
coccyx. So our skull, which actually has a very unique joint, I think it's called a pivot joint, which is
Like a rocking chair. I call it's like a rocking chair. It has the ability to like glide and move, and that's what allows us to stick our necks out, shall we say?
right. And I think
Yeah.
when I looked it up, it's a specific type of joint, either a gliding joint or a rocking joint. I think it was
Yeah.
called a rocking joint because it can actually, our skull can shift in 360 degrees, balancing
It has a
on,
lot. It's C1. You've got like 2 to 3 joints you can play with there. I call it the yes joint is like the top joint, and then
okay,
the no joint is the joint when you shake your head no. That's the relationship between the next joint down. So,
C1
I
and
mean,
C2. So
yeah, so
cervical 1 and cervical 2.
I just call it the yes joint and the no joint. People get that. And then if
Oh,
I give
good.
them the reference of it's behind your nose and in between your ears, that's how high up you should be rotating and moving your head. So that within itself can change everything below it.
That's so interesting because that's actually the same construction from a horse's skull to the first vertebra is also a yes joint. And
Hmm.
it's the second vertebra that actually sort of slots into the first vertebra with something called the dens,
Yeah.
which is a
Hmm.
little bony
That
protrusion.
little, yeah, we've
Yeah.
got that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it's the dens that like the very first joint, which is the axio-occipital joint. So the occiput is the very back of the skull,
Hmm.
and the axis is the first joint. And or the first cervical vertebra is called the axis, right?
Atlas.
Atlas. That's right. The atlas because he
Atlas
holds
is
up the
first,
world.
axis is, yeah, there you go. I like that
Yes.
one. It holds up the world.
Yeah, Atlas holds up the world, which is the skull. And then the axis is the node joint or the
Correct.
rotational, the first joint for rotation.
Right.
And that's exactly the same in the horse. And that's what we call the pole on a horse,
Hmm.
is the back of the skull, first and second cervical vertebra, and sort of all that joint and joint function in between. And I think some people include in the pole on a horse even the joint between C2 and C3.
That's interesting because that's a whole nother podcast about where horses are breaking over now instead of flexing like at the yes joint. The humans are getting them to flex at what, C3, C4?
Yep.
is what I'm seeing in pictures, videos
No, and in a
online.
horse, it's called a dropped pole.
Okay.
So on a horse, like with us, if we're balancing our skull, keeping the joints open and available between the skull and the cervical vertebra,
Mm-hmm.
there's a range of motion available.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at our phones, right? So when we look down at our phones and we're kind of in this position,
Mm-hmm.
it's actually putting stress lower in the neck,
Right.
overusing the joints that are lower than C1 and C2. And that's the equivalent to a horse dropping a pole, which means if you look along the mane, the top side of the horse's neck, when they're in balance, it's a straight shot from the withers up through the mane to the top of the horse's skull. It's a straight
Okay.
line upward or a straight line horizontally. Or in long and low, it's a straight line downward, but it's a straight line without curves and bumps. So when a horse is using the neck the same way we would use our neck to look at our phone, then the mane sort of goes from the withers to the upper middle part of the neck as the highest point.
Mm-hmm.
And then from C2 and C1, it goes back downhill. And a lot of times the horse's nose or the front of their face will be behind vertical, they say, which means tucked backwards towards the torso,
Right.
right? And so the nose is kind of, the neck is over curled and the nose is coming backwards towards the chest. And it's
And
so common.
would you say that's a man-made thing? I mean, do horses do that? I mean, horses don't hang out there.
Excuse
You know
me.
what I mean?
It's a man-made issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Hmm. And it can be because we're putting too much pressure on the bit. And so the horse is trying to escape the pressure in the mouth by retreating backwards
Mm-hmm.
with the skull. It can also be a way that a horse shortens the neck muscles when they drop the back,
Right.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
if like I'm trying to think if I've ever seen a horse do it without it being man-made. And it's
That's what I was trying
possible.
to think. I think I've seen it, but it's very short-lived in play or, there's some sort of herd dynamic thing going on or
When they go into the posture of extension, when they drop the back
right,
instinctually, either out of fear or excitement, or whether they're
right,
playing or they're suddenly afraid, they can sort of over curl the neck
right.
backwards. So
But they don't hang out there. It's not
it doesn't become a habit. It
right. They
doesn't
don't stay
become,
there.
yes. And horses that do that, like one of my horses I was rehabbing was so chronically and habitually ridden in the posture of with a dropped pole and a dropped back that even if I didn't touch the reins, I had to do all of his rehab work with zero rein contact.
Right.
Because even on a loose rein, if I used the right rein or the left rein alternately just to steer or make a correction, he just put his whole neck in that position because that had become the use of his neck that stabilized his body. And he had no stability in his back and in his hindquarters. So that was the only way he had learned to find stability in motion was through shortening the neck muscles. But instead of shortening the neck muscles and elevating the head, which is what we think
Mm,
of when a horse spooks, he had
right.
shortened the neck muscles but curled the head and neck
Curled and they get all that. You
backwards.
can just see all that bulging muscles in their neck. And it's kind of like when we start to get that hump in our neck
Well, I
as
was just going
humans.
to ask you because what's the effect if we're looking at our phones all the time?
Mm,
What do you find in the human neck muscles or stress to the human neck from kind of standing with our head dropped down to our phone
right.
over and over and over? because that
Oh,
can be.
and I see it in people that are working on computers all day. It's
Mhm.
if you're not ergonomically have a healthy relationship with your laptop or your desk or your chair, which those are a whole nother ball game, then you tend to slunch forward. And you also, which is this whole relationship of grabbing with our thumb. And that connection actually brings the shoulder blade up over the body instead of leaving the shoulder blade on the back. So all of that
So what do
leads
you
to
find in people? Like what kind of things start to build? Because in a horse, when they're ridden consistently with a dropped pole, it really can create issues with the TMJs. It can create
good point.
arthritis in the neck. It can make the neck
Hmm.
so tight that horses they'll end up having behavioral problems because they end up having a chronic headache. Like they just have so much tension
Right.
around that delicate area of the skull to the upper neck cervical spine, um, that they can have jaw issues, TMJ issues. They don't want their ears touched. They have sore necks all the time, or they're
Hmm.
just cranky because they're kind of living with enough muscular tension that they probably have a chronic headache.
Well, if you think about it, when at the very beginning of this podcast, us sharing and explaining what we refer to as balance or its availability, because once we start locking everything, if you think of all the soft tissue, um, you're locking all the way down. Say if you're locking your jaw, it affects your hyoid, and there's a piece of fascia that goes from the hyoid bone in your neck to your diaphragm. So
Really?
you could be holding your breath. I mean, it's that connected.
Right.
It's not just that you're locking your jaw. Or I tell people, if all you get out of a session with me is to check in to make sure your yes joint is open and available, then that's a good day.
Yeah.
So, there those relationships throughout the body are critical, that it affects like pole to tail. It's not just the head and neck, it's affecting everything behind it.
Yeah, and I think one of the images that I had kind of a sudden epiphany during Alexander technique work, and I use this when I teach, is I go, if you think of like a Halloween skeleton, it has to be pinned together because it lacks muscle. It's all joints and bones, right?
Right,
And if I imagine that inside, I go, is the skeleton open and available? Is the
right. And
skeleton
we mhm,
balancing with room to adjust, or are my soft tissues so tight that my skeleton is now locked into a position?
exactly. Yeah. That's that whole, when I say open and available, I sometimes use an example. Well, if your knees are locked and a bear's coming after you, the first thing you have to do is unlock your knees before you can run.
Yeah.
You might be dead by then.
Especially if you have to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, why can't I move?
But
Um,
and this is sort of the struggle we all have working with horses because
mm,
like you're saying, if we see a bear, that's a bigger predator than us. So it's
mhm,
going to create like a prey animal fear reaction in
right.
us because we just met a serious predator, right? And that instinct, the instinctual reaction could be to freeze and lock
Yeah.
because we don't know what to do. Like the fear can overwhelm us to the point that instinctually we lock down
Hmm.
or we massively increase muscle tension just to be able to take flight or fight, stand and fight.
Right.
And that's what happens with our horses a lot. So
Good
if they're
point.
not feeling safe or calm within the relationship, then we're really battling that physical instinctual response of kind of locking or
Mm-hmm.
tightening all the muscles because they have to be prepared for fight or flight or they're freezing. And that can, it absolutely works against discovering the best
Mm.
possible coordination. It may save our bacon in the short term,
Yeah.
right? But it's not going
Mm-hmm.
to allow us to use our bodies in the best possible manner.
Right. Yeah.
So do you
And
find with,
that's what
go ahead.
that's the whole training that I went through for Alexander was 3 years. And the first year to year and a half was all about unraveling ourselves
Hmm.
and self discovery, which is extremely overwhelming.
Because you don't know what your habits are,
Mhm.
because by definition, habits have become unconscious. And
Yeah, and
that's
the
kind
body's
of
set
the,
up that way. If I had, well, that's what I do as an Alexander teacher. If I had to think about every movement, I'd be spending a lot of time doing that. But that's what we do. And there's a lot of people that don't want to do the Alexander work because of it, because it is a self-discovery, exploring, your the way you use your body.
yeah. No, and the same with horses, like changing coordination is a big deal.
Hmm.
And the same thing, I know you do it too, but I'll carry my phone with me, especially if I'm working on a rider's balance, because a very small new awareness that comes to our conscious level, or when we consciously change something, some way that we're coordinating our body as a rider,
Hmm.
the reality is we made an adjustment that could be measured in millimeters, but what it feels like to us is we made this massive adjustment that we could measure in inches or feet. And that's the experience of it.
Right.
But I'll often take pictures of people or video to go, first of all, it doesn't look like what it feels like to you right now.
That's a good point.
And it's not as big as it feels to you right now. And people have to see that feedback, that visual feedback loop
I agree.
to
It's really
understand it.
helpful.
Hmm.
Yeah. And that whole is it yeah, healthy visual feedback is that's interesting. A whole nother topic.
That's a
Another
whole
day.
nother topic. Yeah. But that's how deep, if you think about it, coordination is a habit of movement or a
Hmm.
pattern. It's
A
an
pattern, yeah.
established pattern in the nervous system. And as soon as we go to monkey with that pattern, it's going to disrupt the entire system.
Exactly.
And as soon as it comes to our conscious awareness, it's exhausting at first. That's why we don't do it, right? So habits allow us to be efficient so we can think about other things. And
Right.
when we take the time to focus on skeletal coordination and how we organize during motion or our horse, it's like we really have to slow things down before we
Mm,
can change a habit consciously and then integrate that new habit to an unconscious level. But
right.
when we do that, I that's what helps overcome problems, overcome behavioral issues or patterns of lameness in our horse, or makes us a better rider. And it's
Right.
like you have to really slow down in order to move forward.
I
And
completely agree. I think that that is the and what's always interesting to me is that all of this is available, but we don't seek it until we have a problem.
right. No, and I
Instead,
remember seeing your first 6 months that you were in Alexander Technique School. I hadn't seen you in a while. And like you said, it took you had a year to go to school full time to
Mhm.
examine your own coordination and use.
Yeah,
And I saw a massive difference in 6 months, but it
Right.
still took that whole year for
Mhm.
you to integrate new habits into your body. And then it's a constant work in progress, but
Oh, always.
it just keeps getting
You,
easier and
the
faster once you,
questions, yeah, the questions come up, but the answers are more available. You're
yeah.
not floundering out there anymore. You at least, what I like to do is give people tools for their tool belt. And, they can pull out a different tool to address the same thing.
So what are some of your tools that you talk to, the words you use, or other than hands-on, how do you help people explore or improve their head-neck relationship, or you like to say head, neck, back, pelvis relationship, because that's really that axial skeleton really is
Hmm.
the primary axis of the entire body.
That's my view on it. Just with all the knowledge that I have up to date, up till now, that relationship of balancing that part of the organism is critical to healthy function of the rest of it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's the same with horses. And I
Yeah,
go,
that people don't, they look at the kinematics of the legs and see a lameness. And what we really need to be looking at is what's going on in the back.
right, the skull,
Yeah,
spine,
the skull and the
pelvis
spine. What's the
relationship.
use? And granted, I love all these modalities out here, but if we're not addressing balance in movement, we're not going to pick up on things that need to change.
Yeah, I mean, no matter what kind of pain relief or surgery or body work you get
Right.
done as a person or as for the horse, you're not going to change the coordination, the patterns in the nervous system,
Hmm.
except during motion. Like
Right.
that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where you change habits of motion is in motion. So
And
no
it doesn't
static.
have to be a fast motion. Like we
Yeah.
spend at Alexander School 30 minutes to an hour a day for 3 years getting in and out of a chair. I mean,
Yes.
who does that?
Yeah. Or doing the
But
zombie walk. Yeah.
doing all that stuff, it doesn't have to be galloping across, the mountains or whatever. It can be very like at the walk. We do so much work just at the walk that
Well, and
transfers and trickles into trot canter. You know what I mean?
well, because the coordination of the skeleton, especially through the axial skeleton, is ideally the same whether you're walking, trotting, cantering, riding in a half seat, riding with long stirrups, short stirrups, jumping, like that coordination and use, the coordination of the different spinal functions and having the adaptability
I
to
like that word.
it's like you're stabilizing the axial skeleton by adjusting to the use of the body or the forces that are affecting the
Mm,
body constantly.
right.
And so it's never static, it's a constant, minute, subtle adjustment, whether it's the horse or the rider, in order to keep an ideal coordination of the skeleton during motion.
Okay.
And I found, like in all of my work, to really help horses and riders change their coordination and their balance, the work had to be purposefully really simple.
Purposefully.
Because as soon as the work
Mhm.
starts being complex, which is all of your competitive riding,
Right.
that need to focus on the details of the competition meant you weren't going to be able to improve balance at the same time. If,
Good
like,
point.
I look at it and I go, we need super, super simple work, like you're saying, 30 minutes of getting in and out of a chair.
It's exhausting.
Yeah. But that simple activity allows you to take an internal focus.
Yes, I like that.
And that's what I found working with balance for horses and riders is there's a lot of time spent at the walk, mostly because it overwhelms humans to try to work on coordination at the speed of trot or canter. I go, the horse actually, the trot can be a lot easier for a horse to find balance, or the canter can sort of wake up the body in a way that helps them discover balance. But the human can't think that fast or can't maintain conscious awareness at that
Right,
speed, right? And it doesn't matter if we're working at walk, trot, canter, because the coordination is ideally the same. I go, the muscle use changes, the leg kinematics change, but the spinal coordination doesn't change.
right.
So it doesn't matter. We work where we can work. And the simpler the work is, the faster we can habituate new habits that we want in our nervous system or in our horse's nervous system.
Right.
But let's
Yep.
get back to just the head and neck specifically, because I mean, we always go off on tangents. I know you
I love
guys,
it.
but but what do you feel are some of the most key phrases or key things for people to kind of play with their own head
Well,
neck
pretty much what
balance?
I just said about actually realizing that the relationship union between the head and the spine is much higher up
Than we
and
think.
than we think. And if we sometimes that even messes with our vestibular apparatus and can cause dizziness because once we
Mm.
start moving in a different way, it's going to change everything. So I always say, just check in. Just check in with your yes joint. Is it open and available? That's all you need to know. There's
So
no
every time we
place.
nod our head up and down, yes, then we're sort of playing with that first joint. And when
As
we,
long as we're just rotating like way up high, if we start dunking our chin down, that's accessing the lower part of our neck. So it's finding this very little fine-tuned place up at the top to check in with
mm,
that, and even thinking of it higher, like higher up than you think. And
and
that, and the
and more
other thing,
subtle.
and it's very subtle. And to realize that it's not a place. It's not, oh, if I hold this, everything will be okay.
Yeah.
So it's got to be open and available and free to move if we need to access it.
No, and I think you had me stick my fingers in my ears.
Yeah. Yeah,
To
you got to be careful when you say that to kids. So,
But you kind of had me stick my fingers in my ear and just
yeah, just
as
gently place your fingers in your ears and rotate off of those fingers. That's the top joint, and that's the way we should be using it.
interesting.
Yeah,
And then the no shaking of the head side to side is the
yeah.
second joint.
That's the second joint down.
So
Yeah.
do we need to isolate that second joint or is there something?
There's a big connection I like to use with the eyes. What as children, we tend to move our eyes first and have our head follow. And as we become adults, we do the opposite. We tend to move our head and our eyes follow. So that cuts down on our range of motion. So just simple exercises of looking to the right and having your head actually follow your eyes very slowly and then looking back to the straight in front of you, those kind of exercises, so that when you look down at your phone, you're looking down with your eyes and not moving your entire head to look at your phone.
Mm. Or I
Yeah.
learned to lift my phone up more. I'm
Oh,
like,
what a concept.
duh.
I keep telling people, look, you got a wrist and you've got an elbow. Whoa.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah, moving your arm instead of your neck. That's a big one.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then you talked a little bit about the shoulders, and that was a funny experience for me doing Alexander technique work was as many times as I've looked at anatomy books,
Mm,
like I knew, but I didn't know. So this was another weird experience that
hmm
is a little bit ironic, right? So when we're learning to balance, our instincts, ironically, do not help us. And right, when I was looking at my arms as part of my skeleton, especially to improve rain contact and rain use,
Mm,
I knew from looking at pictures, one part of my brain knew there's a scapula, right, that's attached
hmm
to the arms. But it was like a shock to the system when I sort of felt that the ball and socket, the socket is the top of the scapula, and the ball is the top of the, what's the first
Arm, the
arm
upper
bone?
arm,
Yeah,
humerus.
humerus. How could I forget humerus? Um,
Yeah. And that, if you think about it, oh, there's a whole nother, the pinky thing, how I feel about that. But that the
that's a whole
shoulder,
nother podcast. We will
that's a
have to
whole,
talk about the
that's
pinky
like
thing.
the
Yeah.
pinky thing.
But
That'll
I
keep
think
people tuned in.
even realizing that our arms attach to the scapula, which
Hmm
actually are on our back.
Our,
Because
right.
as many times as I looked at anatomy books and I sort of knew that, my brain kept telling me, like if I had to point to my shoulder joint, I was pointing to the sides of my upper arm. I wasn't
hmm
pointing to my back. And just sort of feeling like rolling the humerus, the ball on the humerus around inside the socket on the scapula gave me a totally different experience of where my arms belonged.
hmm Yeah.
And that ties into the whole shoulders back thing. Like the writing
All
instruction,
right.
I mean, like
Yeah.
shoulders back, chin up. And what we tend
All
to
those
do
words.
is rather than just rolling the socket, or sorry, rolling the ball into the socket, which puts our shoulder back, we end up thrusting our chest forward, which
Hmm
actually then arches our lumbar spine and destabilizes our seat, especially as female riders,
Right.
right? You can't thrust your sternum forward in order to get your shoulders back without destabilizing your seat if you're a female rider.
Right. It's
And women
destabilizing
really,
even if you're not riding.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I think women really struggle with
Yeah.
stabilizing their seat as a rider much more than men do.
Yeah. I agree.
But yeah, kind of rolling that ball at the top of the humerus into the socket of the scapula, my whole neck feels softer when I do that. It just
Ah,
relieves a lot of tension in my face, my jaw, my neck, because I don't realize, like if I'm concentrating and I'm sort of pulling my humerus forward,
hmm
almost out of the socket, right? Kind of a slight
hmm
subluxation, even. I get a lot
hmm
of tightness through the chest. I get a lot of
Oh,
tightness
it's
through the
all
neck and
connected.
the jaw. And so
Yeah.
that sort of head neck balance and letting that ball fall into the socket, like instead of
Yeah.
thrusting it back in the socket, then it's a straighter upper body, but it leaves my arms, like you say, open and available for rain contact.
Yeah. Yeah. And that balance of it all of it's such a give and take. And I think, learning how to do that on the ground, just with another person playing with reins is can be huge, or ropes or whatever. You don't have to have reins. It can be anything, elastic bands, um, baling twine.
Yeah.
Just learning that the availability of what your arms can have if you've got balance of your head, neck, back, and pelvis. If you don't, you grab with your arms. It's immediate. It's an instinct.
Yeah. And that sort of segues into what I wanted to talk about with the horse's head and neck, that just like humans sort of go from crawling to walking. We don't know how we do that, but it's a learned skill for a human to go from crawling to walking. And we develop our patterns of how we use our head, neck, back, and pelvis as we're learning to walk. Like that's how
Yeah.
deep it goes in our
It's
experience,
very early. Yep.
right? And for horses, going from crawling to walking essentially means that a horse has this appendage of this really long neck and a very heavy head. So a horse's
Mhm.
head, because it's protecting important stuff, weighs about 1/10 of their body weight. So 1,000-pound horse has 100-pound skull head, right? Then you've got this long neck that is really beneficial to their survival
Mhm.
for, you know, seeing around them for predators or grazing and foraging, but it's not supported. It's this big, long, heavy, big, long neck with a heavy weight at the end that they learn to cope with, right?
Right.
If they don't, they continue crawling, which means that all that sort of extra mass at the front end of their torso pulls them forward and down, putting too much weight on the front legs.
Aha.
The equivalent of going from crawling to walking for a horse is the same kind of learned coordination that humans do going from crawling to walking. A horse has to learn how to kind of bring the hind legs a little closer to the center of their body or engage the hindquarters and stabilize through the thoracolumbar spine and the pelvis. So they have to stabilize sort of the mid to lower parts of their spine and the pelvis and hind legs in order to resist excess body weight falling forward towards that sort of extra mass they have through the head and neck. And when we get on them too soon, or in the domestic environment, horses simply don't move enough to figure
Oh,
that out
that's a
on
good
their
point.
own,
That's a good point.
right? So a
Or it's
horse in
restricted. Yeah.
or is restricted or
Yeah.
confined, and it's not like horses in the wild have to move 20 to 25 miles a day in order to find food and water,
Right.
right? They're nomadic
Mine ain't doing that.
creatures, right? And none of our domestic horses do that because we provide food and water. So
Mhm.
even if we have a herd of 30 horses in a 300-acre pasture, they still know how the food gets delivered, or we
Right.
maintain the pasture so they always have food, or they know where the water source is consistently and we fill it up. So there's never a motivating factor for horses to move 20 to 25 miles a day.
Right.
So for domestic horses, the training has to replace what Mother Nature, is no longer providing them,
That's a
which,
good point.
which is just periods of calm, relaxed motion. And that's their process of going from crawling to walking, or
Mhm.
kind of stabilizing on the front end to stabilizing on the hindquarters and back. And so if they don't learn that, then they really struggle to carry a rider.
Right.
And so when we're adding weight to our domestic horses before they learn how to walk properly by stabilizing motion through the back and hindquarters, then our body weight, even if we're very good riders, our body weight sort of straddling the mid thoracic spine is kind of adding to the front end problem.
And what if we're not even balanced in our own coordination of our own body? I mean, that's like an even bigger hiccup
Yeah,
for
that
the
can make
horse
it
to
even
have to
harder,
deal with.
right? If we're not stable, if we're not balanced, we can tend to exaggerate whatever problem they already have with more
Oh,
weight
that's so true.
and more force.
Yeah.
And so then they really struggle. And that's where all of our behavioral issues and
Mhm.
idiopathic lameness sort of evolves over time.
Right.
So for our horses, the the freedom, like we can sort of think about it as a human And if we're not restricted, we can play with the yes joint and the no joint and our spine and pelvis relationship to improve our balance right away. With horses, and you and we discussed this for years because the Alexander technique for people really starts with the head and neck balance.
That's where the training begins. Yeah. I
But it's
mean,
never a manipulation of somebody's head
no,
and neck.
no,
It's kind of a guidance system.
right.
And
It's just giving
what's
information. Yeah.
tricky with a horse's head and neck balance is their head and neck skeletally plays two important roles. One, it's part of the axial skeleton, like us, right? So the alignment of the skull and the cervical spine to the back and the pelvis is part of stabilizing the entire axial
Mhm.
skeleton. But the second function or role that the horse's head and neck play is kind of a balancing, what do I want to say? It can act as a stabilizer. If they lose stability through the back and hindquarter, the position of the head and neck and the use of the head and neck can kind of be like temporarily used to stabilize so that they don't fall over.
Ah,
So the equivalent would be the way the human uses arms. So if
arms. Yeah.
we're learning to balance on a balance beam, right? Then if
Hmm.
we lose a little bit of stability through our head, neck, back, pelvis, then we kind of put our arms out to the side
Right.
and use that leverage and weight to stabilize our center.
Hmm.
So horses use their neck for the same purpose because they can't lift their front legs off the ground like we can lift our arms, right?
Right.
They're quadrupeds. But the front legs are actually the same parts of the skeleton as human arms.
Yeah.
So
That's always been hard for me to wrap my head around, but I mean, I get it.
so what we call the front knees on the horse
Hmm.
is technically the carpus, and the carpus is the human wrist. So what we call knees are really a wrist and should have the same function as a wrist, right? And then the scapula, right, are on the top of the front legs on the horse, just like our scapula are the very end of our arms. So the front legs on a horse are equivalent to the human arms in design,
Right.
which means they're not meant to be weight bearing forever. Just
That's a
like
good point.
if we crawled into adulthood, we would damage our arms because that's not the design. They're not meant to be weight bearing.
Right.
So horses that are on the forehand for too long damage their front legs because of too much concussion, too much weight. So they do bear some weight, but the stability and use of the back and hindquarter is what resists their own internal body weight from overloading their arms or their front legs. And in that process, like when we're going from crawling to walking, we stick our little arms out all the time
Hmm.
and have to adjust our arms until we
Hmm.
find our stability through our back and pelvis and legs. And that's what a horse has to do, but it's the neck that fluctuates instead of because they can't
Hmm.
pick up their arms for balance. They have to be able to adjust their neck and head.
Wow.
And so understanding that the horse's head and neck has this dual function is really important because it needs to be stable, aligned to the back and the pelvis so that it's not bending and rotating and twisting away from the alignment of the back. That's part of
Right.
the stability of the axial skeleton. But it also needs to have the freedom to move up, down, in, out, maybe a little side to side. Every time the back and hindquarter loses stability, the horse will instantly try to adjust the neck
Right.
up, up, down, in, out. And when we restrict that, even if we have a bitless bridle or whatever, we're going to have reins, or we're going to have a lead rope on our horse and a halter,
Right.
or we're going to have a lunge line. And so every time we start restricting the mobility of the head and neck up, down, in, out, then our horse can't adjust the balance through the back and the hindquarter. They get kind of
Yeah.
stuck there,
It's
right?
kind of like the concept in the Alexander community of, yeah, if you don't get the head neck relationship right, nothing else works.
Yeah, and the only head neck relationship we can guide our horse with during any stage of training would be alternating pressure on the
Oh, that's
left
a good one.
rein or the right rein,
Not
just to help
static.
our horse stabilize a straight alignment of the skull and the cervical spine to the thoracic and lumbar spine and pelvis, because that straight alignment is important for the stability of their whole axial skeleton. But as far as moving it forward, back, up, down, in,
Mm-hmm.
out, as long as it's not left and right, they can get their stability. They can use their neck and head as a balancing kind of temporary mechanism. And you still look around the horse world, and the first thing people are doing, I go, it's like you walk into a tack store and there's 10,000 rein aids, side reins, draw reins. The one that kills me now is the German neck stretcher. Oh my God. I go, it's draw reins made out of
Oh, I've never heard of
bungee
that.
cords. Yeah, and it's gained a lot of popularity because it's made out of bungee cords. People think it's kind because the horse can stretch. But I go, that would be like me wrapping your arms in bungee
Mm.
cords and saying you have plenty of give to get your balance on a balance beam
So
with
you can,
your
yeah.
arms strapped down, you know? And it just
And you think about what that just does to the mind, not just physical restriction, but
oh, it'll make people panic as much as it
yeah,
makes
all of
horses
horses
panic.
panic. Yeah.
Yeah, because you all of a sudden are restricted from finding stability.
Yeah.
It limits your ability to restabilize through the spine and the pelvis. When if you strap a human's arms down, right? Of course, and then you ask them to balance on something that's difficult, or I'm going to strap your arms to your sides and make you carry a heavy backpack. Figure it out,
Mm.
right? And it's like, okay, maybe by hook or by crook or
Yeah,
through talent, some bodies figure it out and other bodies don't. But it's kind of a sink or swim situation because
exactly.
we're restricting rather than allowing that natural mechanism to do its thing. When we start using gadgets and leverage to restrict the mobility of our horse's neck, that's why we see throughout competition, it's become normal for a horse to have a dropped poll. It's so prevalent,
And
doesn't even come up. It doesn't even
that's
become part
why
of the
it's like
conversation.
looking at models walking down runways and how we've taken that as to be the way we're supposed to be.
Mm.
That's another whole podcast there about what are we looking at? Are we looking at a healthy
You,
relationship of balance and use? Even it may not be mainstream because I think mainstream, at least in the English dressage world, is not healthy.
yeah, and I think that's a good point you make that like for humans, we're either mimicking military frame or posture
Right.
or supermodels, right? And I
Or
go,
gymnasts or, all of that
yeah,
is
and that's
not
our,
good use.
and you're saying it's not healthy, ideal use of the
It's not
body.
sustainable. No.
Yeah, it'll create damage.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's sort of when we talked about horse frames versus postural changes. That's the same thing I see is lower level riders mimicking what they're seeing with the
I
people
know.
who are winning competitions. But a horse can win a competition and even perform at a very high level without healthy function of the
True.
head
And so can
and axis.
humans.
Yes.
Yeah. Until something, a pain mechanism you run into, and then the process is evaluated.
Yeah, and I love when people show up as a horse trainer and rider instructor. I love when people have a big fat problem
Yeah.
because now we're going to maybe be willing to do something different. And people who
Hmm.
aren't yet having a big problem are often unwilling to go through that sort of
To look at
slowing
things.
down phase in order to change. It's just hard to be patient with that
Yeah,
unless you have a big fat problem that you need to deal with.
that's it.
Yep. But I think too, in our conversations over the years, it isn't just the head neck balance, which some people can sort of think when they're starting Alexander technique. And I love that you go, well, without a stable pelvis or lumbar spine, it's hard to get the freedom through the head neck balance. And that is exactly how horses find this beautiful, perfect neck position that we're all seeking is to me, in a horse, it's the result of the correct use of the thoracolumbar spine and the pelvis. And if we're
Right.
trying to
Right.
artificially, even through strong rein aids in a bitless bridle or a halter, even if we're just using our rein aids poorly or our reins poorly, trying to artificially create this ideal head neck position with our horses, what we're really doing is destabilizing
Mhm.
the back and the hindquarter. We're making it harder for our horse to stabilize the back and the hindquarter.
Yeah.
So I think that's important that people don't realize, and it really isn't even talked about in the horse industry. It's new. It's a new idea when I present it as a horse trainer. I go, the use of the head and neck in a horse is a reflection of the
Of
use of
what's
the
going
back and the
on. Yeah.
hindquarter. And you can't get it the other way around.
Right.
So the head neck position is like the final achievement of the proper use of the back and the hindquarter. And it's now stable enough that the horse can stabilize the neck and head and no longer needs to make these constant adjustments through the neck and head.
Right.
So a quiet mouth, a stable, steady head and neck position can only come after the horse has figured out how to walk using the back and pelvis instead of the front end and crawling.
Right.
So I know we went a little
Completely
bit
agree.
long. I guess we better wrap it up. But any final words you want to add?
Yep. That was good. No, just if anybody needs to get in touch with us, how do they do that? I think
You
we
know
forgot.
what? We never talk about that. We should
We
tack that
never
on to
talk
some of these podcasts
about
because I've actually been giving
that.
out your contact information because you do remote work. You
Right.
can you can work through Zoom meetings
Hmm.
and video to help people improve their own balance and coordination, whether they ride or don't ride.
Exactly.
And I work with people remotely all the time. I think my two farthest clients have been England and Western Australia. And
Oh, how
the,
fun.
yeah, and the closest clients are within Florida, but it's
There
an
you go.
hour or two away. So, yes, we both do remote work. And in the description box, whether it's the audio on podcast channels or the video on the YouTube channel, we always include your website and my website, which is the best way to get in touch with either one
Yep.
of us,
Great.
depending on what you need. And we both do remote lessons. So
Yes.
yeah, I know we never,
Never
we never think
share.
about that. Maybe we'll add it to the front end of the podcast one time.
Maybe we should.
I don't know if people listen this long. But anyways, if you did, if you hung with us on our blue day,
It's
then
a blue
thank you
day.
for joining us. And we hope you enjoy and learn from these podcasts and go out and try it with your horse. And we love comments. We often think of our topic minutes before we start recording the podcast. So we're always open to suggestions.
Yes, love to go over other people's ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. So thanks for joining us,
Sure.
everybody, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.